You're listening to the Labor Notes Podcast, our weekly show on rank and file news and organizing tactics. I'm Natasha Laney-Ullman, a staff writer at Labor Notes.
And I'm Danielle Smith, an organizer at Labor Notes.
One theme that runs across a lot of our coverage and programming is international solidarity. It's more than just a value to tout, it's how we'll raise conditions for workers across borders without allowing the bosses to pit us against each other. And I think few things make that more explicit than the story of what auto workers in Mexico have been dealing with, from their employers, from some of their unions, and from U.S. trade policy as a whole.
Day ones of the Labor Notes podcast will remember that Natasha covers the independent labor movement in Mexico, where workers have organized some incredibly courageous campaigns to fight so-called protection contracts. These are pro-employer contracts that suppress wages and keep workers constrained by the corrupt unions that negotiate them.
Yeah, and these contracts were also a reflection of Mexican government policy from the 90s, which treated low wages there as a competitive advantage and forcibly maintained them. It's why an auto worker in Mexico earns about $5.70 an hour on average, doing the same work as a U.S. auto worker who earns about 6 times more than that at about $35.30 an hour.
It seems like between that and NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, wages and working conditions remained pretty poor for Mexican workers, while U.S. auto workers lost work because of outsourcing. As you reported, Natasha, 850,000 U.S. workers lost jobs in just the first decade after NAFTA went into effect in 1994. But wasn't NAFTA's more recent successor agreement, the USMCA, supposed to fix some of that?
Yeah, in theory, and it did institute some important changes. It mandated some changes to Mexican labor law that labor activists in the country had been demanding for a long time. The USMCA helped put in place actual labor courts instead of arbitration panels that were often in cahoots with bosses and corrupt company unions. One interesting feature of these reforms was also that it allowed unions and workers to file complaints over some specific instances of union busting through a process known as the rapid response mechanism. And unlike language in past trade agreements, it has teeth. If the complaint is found to have merit, the employer faces sanctions and can even lose access to the U.S. market.
But it sounds though like these reforms aren't actually working the way you'd think, or at least hope.
Unfortunately, impunity remains a really big problem in Mexico. The government is pretty routinely failing to impose sanctions when workers' rights are violated. That's the finding of a report last month by the Independent Mexico Labor Expert Board, or IMLEB, which is a body established under the USMCA that's supposed to keep tabs on Mexico's compliance with the labor law reforms mandated by the trade agreement.
What kind of labor law violations are we talking about here? I'm guessing this is maybe a little more than posters in bathrooms or captive audience meetings or disconcerting text messages begging workers to vote no.
Yeah, the IMLEB report mentions several union organizing campaigns in which Mexican workers received credible threats of violence and retaliation and found little to no evidence of investigation or prosecution by the authorities, including at big employers like General Motors and Saint-Gobain. Workers who want to build democratic fighting unions are up against not only their employers, but their sham unions too. For instance, back in 2022, on the day before a union election at a GM plant in Silao, 3 people in a pickup truck with the license plate removed showed up to the home of the leader of the independent union, Cynthia, threatening her and her family. Another union leader, Claudia Juarez Lopez, received death threats aimed at her and her family over Facebook and the messaging app WhatsApp.
Our day ones will also remember that as terrifying and horrific as that sounds, it didn't even work. As Natasha reported back in April, and we talked about on the pod at the time, GM workers in Silao ended up not only joining Cynthia in that election, but they also won double-digit wage increases this year. And yes, I do live in a world where our day ones know and remember every twist and turn of how this trade war saga has played out for Mexican auto workers, because they love the Labor Notes pod and read research papers about U.S. trade policy on SSRN just as much as we do. So, what happens next to companies who violate the USMCA? Because it sounds like the agreement is pretty clear about what's expected, right? Surely companies can't just get away with openly violating workers' most fundamental labor rights.
I think we all know the answer deep down. The labor law changes that the USMCA mandated were critical improvements. But what good is a critical improvement to the legal landscape if there are no consequences for breaking the law? Although the Federal Center for Conciliation and Labor Registry in Mexico is supposed to impose sanctions on employers who violate workers' rights, something that is articulated quite clearly in the language of the trade agreement, the body itself has denied that it has the power to do so. As an advisor to independent union Cynthia told me, the problem is not the law, the problem is its enforcement.
What have the non-corrupt unions said about all this?
Many independent Mexican unions issued their own report with recommendations as we go into USMCA renegotiations. One thing they propose is a starting floor of about $16 an hour phased in over time. The USMCA already requires that 40 to 45% of auto content be made by workers making this amount. The United Auto Workers issued their own report to the U.S. Trade Representative with their own recommendations too. While they don't mention a specific number for a minimum wage in Mexico, they do call for raising wages to disincentivize offshoring and to create, quote, billions of dollars in new working class purchasing power.
And it seems clear from this story that you can't just legislate those changes, that it has to come from organizing.
Yeah, that's also how the INLEB puts it. Quote, legal reforms alone are inadequate to produce a democratic transformation. It'll take a concerted effort by democratic unions and progressive political leaders in all of the USMCA countries to accomplish the changes, unquote.
So true, MLEB. Sounds like they've been reading Democracy is Power. Well, that's our episode. Please rate us or leave us a review on Apple or Spotify. If you're listening to us on Podbean at labornotespodcast.podbean.com, download our episode.
We're still in the middle of our annual end-of-year fundraising drive. Regular donations from rank-and-file workers help us put on the podcast every week, along with our workshops and troublemaker schools, our reporting, and, of course, the Labor Notes Conference every 2 years. One of the best ways to support us is by becoming a monthly donor, which you can do at labornotes.org/donate. If you start a new monthly donation at $10 a month or more, you'll get our limited edition Fight the Boss, Build the Union t-shirt, along with a free subscription to the Labor Notes magazine. And we'll share regular updates on Labor Notes projects.
We also have a couple of workshops coming up. Our coworker Lisa and I will be running our Winning a Strong Contract series online on Mondays, December 1st and December 8th at 7 p.m. Eastern. It's a 2-part series, so plan on attending both. We've also got an in-person event coming up next month, the Troublemaker School in New Orleans on Saturday, December 6th. You can sign up for all of our events on labornotes.org/events.
The Labor Notes podcast is produced by Daniel Smith, Sindhu Sundar, and myself. Our title music was written and performed by our coworker, Keith Brower Brown. See you next week. Solidarity all.